Welcome to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Centre podcast. Each episode, we'll bring you insights from our expert counselors and tips and strategies to improve your mental well-being. I'm your host, Katherine Hurtig. Calgary Counseling Centre and Counseling Alberta provide effective counseling for anyone in Alberta with no wait list and no financial barriers. Find us online at calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. In this episode, we'll be discussing different coping skills and how they can help you when facing challenges. To discuss this topic, I reached out to Krista Beck, registered social worker with Calgary Counseling Centre. Krista talks about the difference between healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, what and where emotional coping methods usually stem from, how to teach your children healthy coping habits, and much more. The conversation within this podcast episode was originally live streamed on Calgary Counseling Centre's Facebook page on January 27th, 2021. At this time, we were still experiencing uncertainty and restrictions around the COVID-19 pandemic. That will be reflected in my conversation with Krista, but know that the coping tools and strategies that she explains are still very applicable and can help us navigate tough times. So to start off, Krista, can you tell us what coping skills are and when we would need to use them?
Absolutely. So coping skills are basically just strategies that we use to deal with difficult emotions. So things like fear, stress, disappointment, frustration, and they can help to alleviate distress. So the thing about coping skills is that we're all using them already in essence, but some of them may be healthy and some of them may not be so healthy.
Right.
And sometimes it's really just the small, simple coping skills that can be really quite effective. Like you find yourself in a kind of intense conversation with someone before you respond, taking a deep breath to kind of calm your nerves a little bit can really help in that situation. So it's interesting because I think people sometimes feel like, well, I don't have any coping skills, but that's not true. They may be using a lot of coping skills, but they just may not be the best coping skills.
Mm-hmm. Or really, they're not so conscious of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. What are some coping strategies you suggest that people have in their toolbox to handle these kinds of stressors?
And that's such a good question because so many people are dealing just with that global stress of everything that's going on and feeling more isolated and alone. And so some things that can really help, like especially if somebody's working at home or maybe if someone isn't working and feels like they just have these kind of endless days ahead of them, having a schedule or routine is really important. Mm-hmm. Trying to go to bed and wake up at the same time. It's tempting, especially if there's not a lot going on, to maybe stay up half the night and sleep, but then your sleep patterns get all messed up. And then if you're low on sleep, it's easy to feel emotional and frustrated and stressed out. So having a bit of a schedule, not down to like every 10 minutes, but just what are those regular things that happen during the day? Some structure is so helpful. And staying connected as best as a person can. So like lots of people are doing Zoom calls or playing games with family. My mom plays Scrabble with my aunt and I'm not sure how they do it. They do it on Skype and they each have their own board and all the letters, but they've worked it out. So they still have that connection. Okay. So it works out really well for them. So whether it's group hangouts or Zoom or some of those gaming like apps that you can go on and actually play a game together, that works really well to keep that connection with people that you really know and have like a real life connection to and can maintain that. Mm-hmm. Then some of the other things are to look at what is within my sphere of influence. Like what do I have some control over? What can I change? So I can look after my health. I can try to have good sleeping patterns. I can try to maintain, drinking water and exercise. These are things that I do have some control over and can do something about. Yeah. This probably people have heard this throughout the time of the pandemic, but it's a good time to learn a new skill. I keep thinking, I want to learn Spanish. Like I could go on Duolingo and, check that out. Or there's free courses online or just even searching up like a new hobby, like getting into knitting or learning how to sew, whatever those things are. YouTube has a video for everything. Yeah, you want to learn how to do. I've been trying to learn crochet. It's more challenging than I thought. And then things like mindfulness or meditation. there's some really great apps out there like Headspace, I think Calm,
Hmm.
those sorts of things. I have a few of them on my phone. I always get the names mixed up, but I actually just turned one on last night because I was having trouble sleeping. I think just, a lot rolls around in your mind. So I turned it on and, you're listening to it and next thing you know, you've fallen asleep. So those kinds of things can help. But even during the day too, if you're finding yourself stressed out,
Hmm.
limiting screen time is really important. I think there's the feeling of like, especially when I'm at home and there's not a lot of other things to do, a person could easily be on the computer, their phone, TV from morning to night with no
Right.
break. But it's not really helpful depending on what a person is doing, like especially on some of the social media sites, like getting involved in maybe a lot of arguments on Twitter or reading about people doing things on Facebook. And, I have a friend who said they were just getting really depressed because they were looking at Facebook and some of the people they knew had seen family at Christmas and gone on vacations and like things that were, maybe recommended not to do. And so they really felt they were missing out and it made them feel worse in the situation. So, we were talking about maybe getting off of Facebook. And then despite the fact that it is a pandemic, there are still ways to be involved and volunteer. Like, Google volunteering online. Maybe a person could be sending letters to a local long-term care facility without having to go there and volunteer in person or to make some donations or, there are still ways to be involved that really would help a person's mood and help with purpose, even without getting out of the house.
Yeah, that can definitely have a positive effect on mood. It's just finding ways to put your focus on other people and helping others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We can't avoid challenges and stresses in our lives, but we can choose how we respond to those stresses by learning healthy ways to cope and manage challenges. Having a variety of healthy coping tools can help us deal with negative emotions we have and improve our quality of life. These tools can help to prevent mental health problems, build resiliency, and increase self-confidence. Can you talk a bit about the difference between, healthy and unhealthy coping skills?
Yeah, absolutely. So healthy coping strategies or skills contribute to long lasting positive outcomes. They may not necessarily be the easiest things to do kind of in that moment, but they certainly lead to better outcomes and longer lasting success. So
Mhm.
things like exercising, talking it out with a friend or a professional, booking an appointment with a counselor, eating healthy, doing relaxation techniques. So things like progressive muscle relaxation, which is when you tense and release your muscles from toe to head, which can help to calm your body down. Using social supports like friends or family, doing some problem solving, trying meditation or grounding techniques, yoga, all of those sorts of things are what we consider healthy coping skills. Now, unhealthy coping skills or strategies that people use, there's quite a few that fall under that category. They often provide instant gratification or relief when someone's feeling some distress. The
Mhm.
problem is they can sometimes have long-term negative consequences. So things like drinking alcohol, a drink or two might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't necessarily resolve any issues. So the thing about alcohol is it's a depressant. So it can make you feel worse. And it can also lead to things like addiction or problems in that area, creating more issues instead of solving the issues that were the problem in the first place. Other things are, and it's interesting because with unhealthy strategies, some of them don't necessarily sound negative at first glance, but can lead to long term problems. So things like sleeping too much. Many people, when they feel stress, automatically feel tired. They feel like having a nap or going to sleep. But when you wake up, the problem is still there and has not been resolved, and sometimes is worse, especially if it was something that needed to be attended to quite quickly.
Right.
Venting to others, which is not the same thing as talking out your problems with somebody. If you get in the pattern of just venting and venting and venting, it can actually be quite negative, and it keeps someone in that issue or in that problem, and it can kind of spiral instead of them feeling better. I'm sure most people have also heard of things like retail therapy. I think that's been a term that's been around for a little while. And many people say, I'm going to engage in some retail therapy. But the problem is then, especially if there's an issue already with finances or things like that, makes the problem far worse. So again, instant gratification, but long-term negative effects. Even things like eating or controlling one's eating. So sometimes when people are having a hard time, they may overeat, which then leads to its own issues and maybe weight problems, or they're trying to control a situation, so may really restrict what their intake is, which then might lead to an eating disorder. So those are all things that may be considered unhealthy coping strategies.
So some of these strategies we're talking about aren't so healthy. If you're avoiding a problem, or retail therapies, you say, or sleeping too much, those aren't necessarily, like, they aren't bad in and of themselves, right? Like, if, we do them every once in a while, that's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you're so right. Like every once in a while is different than getting in that pattern. So,
Yeah.
if someone's had a really stressful week and they go out with friends on a Friday night, well, things are a little different in the world right now, but, have a couple drinks with a friend, that's one thing. And maybe they're getting social support out of that and able to talk things through with a friend. But if that becomes a nightly event, then are they becoming late for work? Are they becoming more dependent on that instead of actually dealing with the problem? So a lot of it is about moderation.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. Like maybe doing one of those things like once or every once in a while, or, every so often isn't a big deal, but an ongoing pattern of that could become problematic.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about some of the different types of coping strategies and how they can be beneficial? So I'm thinking like coping strategies focused on emotions or, certain behaviors, social coping strategies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of three main that a lot of those other subcategories fall under. So one of them is emotion focused. This one is really about regulating negative emotional reactions to stress. And these can be helpful, especially if someone's dealing with a problem that isn't, or a stressor that isn't necessarily changeable. So maybe someone is like really stressed out at work, but they need to keep that job. They need to pay their bills. So that isn't necessarily something that will change. So how do they cope with that stress? So things like just even learning how to label feelings, doing breathing exercises. I think a lot of people undervalue breathing exercises, not realizing that it can really help to calm your body down, which then triggers your brain into thinking you're more calm. So it's actually a very helpful thing to do.
Yeah.
Also, things like journaling, engaging in things that someone finds really enjoyable, like reading or doing artwork. Now, some of those things aren't going to happen during the day at work, but certainly when you're like at work, you can do some deep breaths. You could do that progressive muscle relaxation sitting at your desk. One that I really like is called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's kind of a grounding technique.
Yeah.
And so it's a really good one. So you can start by just, even if you're in your office, work seems to be a good example. And many people are working from home and that may be causing its own stress. But so you look around and see 5 things that you can see, and then 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. Or sometimes I like to kind of shake it up and say 1 thing that you're thankful or grateful for, like just to end it on a bit of a different note. So then cognitive behavioral is another type of coping skills or coping strategies. This one's more about reframing thinking or trying to change thinking patterns that will then hopefully change our behaviors because those are so closely connected. So these are things like self-monitoring, like observing ourselves from a bit of a distance, like how am I handling this? What are my triggers in this situation?
A bit of reflection.
Yeah, exactly. So that reflection, setting and managing goals fits really well under that. So, what do I need to do? What will help me? And how do I work on those? And then trying to look at situations and like, so for example, maybe we're stressed at work. We think like our boss, is really mad at us, doesn't like us, whatever that is. So in cognitive restructuring, then we think about what are some alternatives to that? What could be happening instead of the assumption that we're making? So it can help to deal with the problems in that way. So maybe our boss is just really stressed out themselves. Maybe there's been people who have quit recently and they're trying to hire new staff, and that's been really, taking up their mind. It might have nothing to do with us, but we might be putting our worry, projecting that, and then thinking that something's wrong between our relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one of the main ones is problem focus. So this is actually really helpful if there is a situation that is changeable. So, making a list of pros and cons. So, maybe someone is trying to decide between two jobs and they're really stressed out. So what are the pros and cons of each? Because they can have some control in that situation, or they can ask for help. They can go through a problem solving process. And then, there are those things that fit under those categories, like social supports and social access. But they mainly go under those main headings of problem solving skills.
Right. Finding the right coping skills and tools that will work for you will be a bit of a trial and error process. Do a little self-reflecting and think about how you cope with the problems in your life. Ask yourself what your go-to coping strategies are. Like Krista said, it's important to have ways to regulate and soothe strong emotions in the moment, like breathing exercises, but also a variety of tools to cope longer term. Writing in a journal or going for a run may not be your thing, and that's okay. Experiment with activities that you enjoy. Incorporate activities that include physical activity, social connection, creativity, acts of service, and mindfulness.
These strategies that you're talking about, whether they be, focusing on our emotions or reframing our thoughts, these grounding techniques, do you have any advice on how we can sustain these habits?
Yeah, practice is one of the huge parts of this, like just getting in a habit, trying to do them on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
At first, they seem a little bit clunky, maybe, and a little bit difficult. Like when I talk to people about meditation and they've never tried that before, some people are like, well, that sounds a little too like new agey for me, or how will that fit in my schedule? And so sometimes it's just getting over the hump of just giving it a try. Like it's not helpful when you're running out the door and have 2 minutes to spare to then decide to do a 20-minute meditation. Of course, that's not going to work out very well, but maybe before bed or first thing in the morning. Like, so we have to pick a time that works in our schedule and then try to do it on a consistent basis. Our smartphones are so available and can do so many things. So set a reminder, oh yeah, meditation, 9:30 tonight, then I'm going to bed. Like, so just to get in that habit of it.
So my last question, Krista, is how can parents help their children in building and practicing coping strategies?
A large part of it is being open about like our own, to a level that's appropriate for children, but to be open about our own stressors and difficulties and how we're coping with those, to role model that. So even, saying things like, man, it was a bit of a stressful day at work today. I think I'm going to go for a walk tonight. That'll help me to kind of clear my mind. So talking through those things, dinner time is a great time for that sort of thing, because people often talk about how their day was. The kids are back in school face to face. So, they can talk about how that went. It can also help, especially with like younger kids who maybe aren't as able to articulate this, but to make sure that they have the words to identify those feelings. Like frustration, isn't the same thing as maybe being mad, or like, are you sad about something or disappointed, or, so talking through some of those words and establishing triggers. When my son was young, having to shut down the Xbox and leave the house was definitely a trigger and would cause a lot of upset. So, okay, you're feeling really frustrated because you had to stop in the middle of the game. How do we handle that? So yeah, finding those words, and, and even adults sometimes are like, growing up, I didn't really learn how to label my emotions really accurately. So that can be helpful for all ages. And then providing ideas of coping skills to try. So let's try taking some deep breaths, or like, I'm going to do yoga. Do you want to do that with me? And, try some of those things, go for a walk together, or do like an art project, or talk about journaling and have them write down a few sentences, are all really good ways to involve them and help them understand why we're doing what we're doing in response to the stress that we're feeling. And hopefully they'll see that role modeling and pick that up.
Right.
You've been listening to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Centre podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was produced by Nick Here, Louisa Campos, Amelia Hawley, Eric Tanner, and by me, Katherine Hurtig. A special thanks to Krista Beck. The conversation within this podcast was originally live streamed on Calgary Counseling Center's Facebook page on January 27th, 2021. To stay up to date on our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe. We're available in your favorite podcast app. Living Fully is a production of Calgary Counseling Center and recorded in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Living Fully podcast is not a substitute or alternative for professional care or treatment. If you're in Alberta and need help, please go to calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. For help across Canada and the United States, call 211. If you are outside of Canada and the US, seek help from your general medical practitioner.